For many years, secularism has been a misunderstood concept in the U.S. Many people equate secularism with atheism and associate it with communism. There are, of course, reasons for this, but it has less to do with fact and more with fear-mongering. There are different forms of secularism depending on the context of the situation. For the purposes of this video, I will be discussing political secularism. This means the definition of secularism I will be using is the belief that church and state should remain separate. Rather than standing against religion, a secular society actually defends the rights of religions better than a religious society would. A separation of church and state is necessary for a society that intends on treating all of its citizens equally. A secular state allows any religion to be practiced by anyone, but doesn't favor any view. This seems like a pretty simple concept. The government and other publicly funded institutions should not be religious or irreligious. With the removal of school-sponsored prayer and intelligent design, it seems like a non-issue. But even today, students in public schools can experience religion being promoted in their classroom. Centuries ago, a secular world would have been impossible, since the largest regimes believed their ruler was chosen by God. Church and state were intrinsically tied together. Over time, there have been multiple secular states, but the one I will be discussing saw secularism to be so important that the Founding Fathers wrote it down in their First Amendment: the United States. Religion in government has been an issue since the founding of the country, but despite what many in the religious right claim, the U.S. is not a Christian nation. The writings of the Founding Fathers make it pretty clear. The first thing to examine is the Establishment Clause in the First Amendment. Along with freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and the freedom to petition, the First Amendment also establishes that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. This guarantees the freedom of religion and freedom from religion. Some would argue that the Declaration of Independence proves the U.S. was built on religious grounds, with the inclusion of a creator in the first sentence of the second paragraph. The words attributed to Thomas Jefferson have become immortalized in American culture. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. There are two main issues with using this as a basis for claiming the Founding Fathers built this nation off religious thought. The first being that the Declaration of Independence is not a legislative document. It doesn't protect rights and liberties. It's more of a notice to Great Britain that the states are separating. The document protecting your rights and liberties is the Constitution, which, as we already covered, keeps the nation secular. The second issue is that Jefferson didn't even write this in the way it's presented. He originally wrote a rough draft, and Congress later edited and approved of the document. One of the changes was the inclusion of the word creator. Jefferson's original document said nothing of the sort. While many of the Founding Fathers were theists, some were deists, and as such, it was in everyone's best interest to remain secular and make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Even though the Constitution supports secularism, religion, and Christianity specifically, has always been a part of American culture. Most people in the U.S. have been Christian, so it's expected that religion would play some role. Religion in publicly funded forums reached its apex in the 1950s. With the Cold War looming and the Red Scare in full swing, Americans felt the need to distinguish themselves from those godless communists, and two decisions were made that changed the landscape of secular debates for decades to come. The first of these was the addition of "under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance. The famous words we were all told to recite at the beginning of our school days, originally written by Francis Bellamy, went through plenty of revisions since its conception in 1892. The major and most recent addition was the phrase "under God," which was added in 1954. In an attempt to stand against the communist regime, President Dwight Eisenhower approved the addition of "under God" to the pledge. Many people in the States aren't even aware of this change. In circulation recently, there's been a screenshot of an old Looney Tunes episode from 1939, Old Glory. In it, we see Porky Pig trying his best to read the pledge, but a short segment in which the words themselves can be seen, there seems to be something missing. The curious "under God" phrase. Just 2 years later, Eisenhower also approved "In God We Trust" as the nation's official motto. This is clearly religious and stands in opposition to the Establishment Clause. The new motto stood in contrast to the former de facto motto, "E pluribus unum," out of many, one, referring to the development of one nation out of the 13 colonies. On that same day, Eisenhower also signed into law a requirement that "In God We Trust" be printed on all U.S. currency. Before that point, certain coins already had the phrase printed on them, but the tone of the discussion shifted. In his efforts to fight against the Stalinist regime in Russia, Eisenhower crossed what should be seen as a clear line separating church and state. During this time, and even prior to Eisenhower's decisions, it was common that public schools began their days off with a prayer. One of the school districts with school-led prayer would eventually pose a problem for parents of multiple children who claimed the prayer went against their religion. In 1962, we see the landmark case of Engel versus Vitale. Leading up to this, in 1951, the New York State Board of Education decided that students would be encouraged to start their day off with a non-denominational prayer. The school claimed the decision to pray was voluntary, but the student needed permission to opt out of the prayer from their parents. Effectively, it wasn't really voluntary. 5 parents complained about this prayer, and the case went to court. It was a failed endeavor in smaller courts, but when the case reached the Supreme Court in 1962, the court ruled 6-1 that it is neither sacrilegious nor anti-religious to say that each separate government in this country should stay out of the business of writing or sanctioning official prayers. Basically, they agreed with the plaintiffs that the school-led prayer in public schools was unconstitutional and violated the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. Another landmark case was Lemon versus Kurtzman in 1971. Pennsylvania had been giving tax dollars to religious private schools based on a recently passed act, the Non-Public Elementary and Secondary Education Act. This allowed the superintendent of public schools, David Kurtzman, to use tax dollars to reimburse private school teachers. Alton Lemon, the plaintiff, argued that the act was unconstitutional, citing the Establishment Clause. To further demonstrate the point, the lawyer of the plaintiff, Henry Sawyer, stated in his opening that
the act provides for considerable new state regulations of the schools, the non-public schools, and when I say non-public, it's to be understood, of course, that these are largely church-affiliated schools, 97%. And 97% of that, 97% is Roman Catholic.
The court ruled that this was, in fact, unconstitutional. In addition, they provided a 3-pronged test in order to avoid violating the Establishment Clause. This has been affectionately named the Lemon Test, after the plaintiff. The statute must have a secular legislative purpose, its principal or primary effect must be one that neither promotes nor inhibits religion, and it must not foster excessive government entanglement with religion. Keep in mind that the Lemon Test is not the only test courts use to determine if there has been a violation of the Establishment Clause. Jumping over 30 years into the future, we reach the biggest case regarding secularism in recent times, the Kitzmiller versus Dover trial of 2005. The case and all of its parts are fascinating, so I encourage you to look into the details of it. To summarize, in 2004, the Dover Area School District in Pennsylvania told its science teachers to prepare an intelligent design curriculum to be taught alongside evolution in the science classrooms as an alternative. They suggested using the textbook Of Pandas and People, a book which advocated for intelligent design, the idea that life has all the hallmarks of being designed by an intelligent designer. The teachers, being the educators that they are, complained and told the board that they took an oath that they would not teach anything they knew was false. In response, the board required that before class, the superintendent would have to read a minute-long speech about intelligent design. The speech claimed that evolution was a theory, theories are not facts, and ID was just another explanation. Moving past the major misunderstandings about evolutionary theory, many parents complained, and the case went to court, which ruled that the introduction of intelligent design into public schools was unconstitutional on the grounds that it was nothing less than the progeny of creationism. Even though the decision was made in late 2005, the online community has been debating over it for the past 13 years. With the trial over and debates still raging, secular activists have remained vigilant, but maybe not as much as they ought to be. The problems that plagued Dover, Pennsylvania all those years ago are still prevalent in public schools across America, even though they are much more subtle. Students are still encouraged to follow Christianity in small, sneaky, and not so clever ways. No student should feel pressured into following the faith of the majority, but that problem never seems to come to a close. In 2014, the Texas State School Board declared that Moses was a founding father and that the Mosaic Law inspired the creation of the U.S. They argued that the nation was built on Judeo-Christian values and that the founding fathers had Moses in mind when writing the Constitution. There was a good amount of backlash to this, but regardless of the amount of professors and educators that came out against this, Moses is still listed as a founding father in public school textbooks. To the Texas State School Board, it doesn't matter that none of the founding fathers listed Moses as one of their influences, nor does it matter that only 2 of the 10 commandments are actually U.S. law. Those are don't murder and don't steal, but it doesn't matter because those weren't exclusive to the Mosaic Law. Furthermore, critical scholars are in agreement that Moses probably wasn't a historical person. The Texas School Board also claimed that Moses invented democracy. That is patently false. The Hebrew Bible describes the judges, people who were chosen by God himself to rule over Israel. After the period of the judges, we have the establishment of the monarchy, where a new king was usually part of the Davidic lineage. In any case, none of it is by any means democratic. The inclusion of Moses as a founding father is clearly based on the religious thoughts of the board members and is used to promote American exceptionalism. There is no doubt about it. This is the intrusion of religious propaganda in public schools. Even more recently in Wisconsin, students have been subject to discrimination and alienation from the teachers. One such case concerns St. John's Lutheran School in Baraboo, where students were occasionally being expelled and denied enrollment on the basis of their sexuality or their gender identity. The school would require parents to send in their child's birth certificate so they would know what the biological sex of every student was. The school would also send out a handbook for the parents to sign, which, among other things, listed the grounds on which a student could be expelled. This list included homosexuality. While St. John's is a private school, it was operating with federal funding for programs like free lunch. This means the school must comply with federal civil rights laws. There was an investigation into the school by the Freedom from Religion Foundation after they received complaints from parents whose children were expelled or denied enrollment. After being questioned on these rules, the school pastor, Nick Maglietto, claimed that the school does not intend to exclude people, but it is not welcoming to homosexual and transgender students. The school deems themselves worthy of judging others on the basis of the Bible. 2 other cases concern the actions of teachers in Kenosha. At Roosevelt Elementary School, teacher Donna Rover was displaying religious imagery in her classroom. This imagery included a Latin cross over the whiteboard, a poster promoting devotional Christian music by Chris Tomlin, a poster that says "In God We Trust" and "Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord," and a poster of vices and virtues citing a Bible verse. The second issue was that students at several of the schools regularly attended field trips to Camp Timber-Lee, a Christian recreational camp whose mission is to help each person encounter Christ. They also have a creation walk, a 7-room display which correlates to the 7 biblical days of creation. The camp does not take public school students through this exhibit. However, Karen Good, the outdoor education director at Camp Timber-Lee, has claimed that the curriculum is designed to open their eyes so when they go back to school and hear about evolution, they say, "Oh, that sounds goofy." In response to this, parents reached out to FFRF and a letter was sent to the superintendent informing the faculty that the religious displays must be removed from classrooms and school walls and that the Kenosha United School District must not allow or promote religious instruction. Quoting the Supreme Court ruling from the Santa Fe Independent School District versus Doe in 2000, Ryan Jayne, the constitutional attorney who authored the letter, concluded that religion is a divisive force in public schools. The Supreme Court has repeatedly noted that school sponsorship of a religious message is impermissible because it sends the ancillary message to members of the audience who are non-adherents that they are outsiders, not full members of the political community, and an accompanying message to adherents that they are insiders, favored members of the community. Just under our noses, the religious are slowly trying to push their personal ideologies on public school students. As can be seen, there is outright discrimination, subtle manipulation, and sneaky promotion of a particular religion. There is a lot of variation in the degrees in which public schools endorse religion. Some are blatant, some are covert, and yet others aren't even pretending not to stand against the First Amendment. This battle for the separation of church and state is far from over. So what are some things we can actually do about it? The first, and probably most efficient way to enact change, is by contacting organizations like FFRF or the ACLU. This would especially be useful in gray area cases where the constitutionality isn't exactly clear. This would at least set a standard on the issue. Another way to change the landscape of religion in public schools would be through training teachers to keep their personal religious beliefs out of the classroom. How would a Christian teacher feel if their child had to attend a class with verses from the Quran written on the walls? Probably not very good, even if the subjects were taught in a secular way. Warren Blumenfeld, former associate professor at the School of Education at Iowa State University, wrote a paper on the insurgence of religion in public schools. In the paper, he lists a variety of ways in which teachers can learn to respect everyone's beliefs in the classroom. Among other ways, he suggests educating staff on world religions, hiring with more religious diversity, and enacting policies that protect students and faculty from discrimination or violence. But perhaps the best way to enact change would be just through having these discussions. This may be a slower way, but the change this conversation drives will be upheld by those you're talking to. Actually talking to people about the effects of religion in the public school system might change some minds. None of this will be easy, so be alert and pay attention to things going on in your community. It might be hidden in plain sight. Thanks for watching.